Abigail, her name means the father's joy, yet her life began in the shadow of a loveless and dangerous marriage. She was a woman of rare beauty and divine wisdom, bound to a man whose very name meant fool. It should have been a life wasted in silence, until one day, a single decision placed her between the rage of a future king and the ruin of her entire household. This is the kind of moment where destiny hangs by a thread. One wrong move, and everything collapses. One right move, and history changes forever. Abigail's choice that day not only saved lives, it set her on a path no one could have imagined. A path that would take her from the home of a fool to the side of royalty. If you believe that God can take the most impossible situations and turn them into testimonies of victory, type 777 inches, the comments, as your declaration of faith. That simple act is more than just a number, it's your agreement with heaven's power to redeem. And to all who have supported this channel, especially through super thanks. My deepest gratitude. Your kindness helps keep these stories alive. Now, walk with me into the ancient hills of Judah, where a lavish feast, a reckless insult, and a courageous woman collide in one of the Bible's most unexpected transformations. Abigail's impossible story, from a fool's wife to David's queen. Abigail, a name that, in the ancient Hebrew tongue, means the father's joy. In the world she was born into, names were more than mere sounds. They were blessings, prophecies, even burdens. A name could carry the weight of one's character or the shadow of one's destiny. Her name should have been a promise of a life steeped in delight. Yet the early chapters of her journey told a different story, one where joy was often out of reach, where her days began under the shadow of a marriage that seemed to contradict the very meaning of her name. She was remarkable, not just in appearance, but in mind and spirit. The scriptures are unambiguous in their praise. Abigail was an intelligent and beautiful woman, 1 Samuel 25:3. Her wisdom was not the kind that spoke loudly, it was the quiet, steady kind that could read the shifting winds of a situation long before others felt the breeze. But fate, or perhaps divine design, had bound her to a man who was her complete opposite. Nabal, her husband, was not remembered for kindness or insight. Instead, he was infamous for being harsh in manner and evil in his dealings. A man whose wealth was vast, yet whose soul was bankrupt of understanding. Surrounded by large flocks of sheep and goats, he lacked the one thing that could have made all his abundance a blessing: wisdom. Even his name was an unflinching portrait of his nature. In Hebrew, Nabal means fool, not a title given in jest, but a reflection of a dangerous truth. Imagine living each day with a name that proclaimed recklessness, stubbornness, and moral blindness, and then living in such a way that proved it accurate. That was Nabal, arrogant in his wealth, selfish in his pleasures, deaf to reason, and utterly unconcerned about the storms his actions could unleash. He was a man who seemed determined to fulfill every letter of his name. And then there was Abigail, a woman of discernment, poised between beauty and brilliance, grace and strength, outwardly radiant, inwardly resilient. She could see paths others missed, sense dangers others ignored. But how does a woman like that end up tethered to a man like Nabal? Was it the iron grip of family arrangement, the political maneuverings of clans and tribes, or was there something hidden, a divine purpose moving beneath the surface, one that would only reveal itself in the crucible of crisis? In the world of the Bible, Marriage was rarely a matter of personal choice, especially for women, and especially among the wealthy. Families dealt in alliance, not romance. To them, marriage was a binding contract of status, resources, and security. It is highly probable that Abigail never had a voice in the decision that would shape so much of her life. Women were seen as threads in the fabric of a family's social and economic standing, and those threads were woven wherever the head of the household deemed most advantageous. Perhaps her father, gazing at Nabal's overflowing flocks and vast estate, believed he was securing his daughter's future. From the outside, it must have looked like a perfect match: stability, protection, wealth. But beneath the surface, it was the sealing of a door into a life of quiet misery. One wonders what Abigail felt in those first days. Did she sense from the start the darkness that came with his arrogance? Or did it reveal itself slowly? Like cracks spreading across a wall, the scriptures leave us without her words on this matter. And perhaps that silence is telling. For what is truly fascinating is not just the fact of her unhappy marriage, but the way she bore it. The Bible offers no scene of her lamenting her fate, no line of her railing against heaven, no whisper of bitterness crossing her lips. In a time when many might have grown hardened or resentful, Abigail's character shone with a quiet, steadfast dignity. She became the kind of woman whose reputation was built not on complaint, but on competence. She managed her household with wisdom, ensuring that even in the shadow of Nabal's foolishness, things were kept in order. Her name became associated not with scandal or rebellion, but with understanding and discernment. And here's where the mystery deepens. How does someone remain unbroken, unpoisoned by the environment they are trapped in? How does a spirit stay clear when the air around it is thick with arrogance and folly? If you were Abigail, waking each morning beside a man whose actions could bring ruin on the household, would you be able to hold your peace? Or would you feel the pull to step out of the shadows and alter the course of events before disaster struck? This is the moment in Abigail's story when the shadows begin to shift, and her quiet strength edges toward the light. The scriptures paint a clear picture of Nabal's immense wealth, 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, a fortune in livestock that marked him as a man of high standing. And in the season of shearing, that fortune only grew. In ancient Israel, sheep shearing was far more than a routine chore. It was a season of abundance, a time when the labor of the past months blossomed into tangible reward. Think of it as the farmer's harvest, a festival marked by feasting, generosity, and the honoring of those whose hands had helped secure the bounty. It was customary, even expected, for landowners to open their hands in gratitude, sharing both food and provisions with those who had safeguarded their flocks. It was in this setting, a time that should have been overflowing with goodwill, that one of the most dramatic turning points in Abigail's life began to take shape. But here's what is so often overlooked. Abigail was not merely a decorative figure in her husband's household, standing silently in the background of his affairs. No. While Nabal busied himself with greed and self-indulgence, it was almost certainly Abigail who bore the weight of running the estate. She was the one who managed the flow of provisions, directed the servants, and kept the intricate workings of the household steady. If a problem arose, it was her judgment that resolved it. If a need was urgent, it was her resourcefulness that met it. This explains something the biblical text later makes strikingly clear. The servants trusted her deeply. In a world where speaking against one's master could be dangerous, they still came to her when the unthinkable loomed. They knew where wisdom could be found, And it was not in Nabal. Can you imagine that? Living in a household where every life depends on decisions. Yet the one holding the title of master is the least capable of making them. And then the stage was set for the test that would strip away all pretenses. A single act of Nabal's arrogance, one rooted in his blindness to both custom and decency, would ignite the anger of the wrong man. That man was no ordinary shepherd or passing traveler. He was David, the warrior who had slain Goliath, the leader of loyal fighting men, the anointed future king of Israel. One insult to him was an insult to God's chosen purpose. The question was no longer if trouble would come, but how quickly it would arrive, and when it did, would Abigail stand aside, or would she step into the storm? Nabal possessed everything a man of his time could dream of: fertile land stretching across the hills, flocks that dotted the valleys like moving clouds, and a household bustling with servants and activity. His wealth spoke loudly of success, but his character whispered a dangerous truth. He lacked the one thing that could preserve it all: wisdom. And it would not be long before his pride placed not only himself, but every soul under his roof in peril. The season of sheep shearing arrived, a time of festivity in Israel, when the year's labor brought forth abundance, and generosity was expected of those who prospered. For Nabal, this should have been a season of goodwill. Throughout the months, David and his men, though living as fugitives, hunted by King Saul, had been a silent wall of protection around Nabal's shepherds. They had guarded the flocks from desert raiders, kept wild beasts at bay, and ensured not a single lamb was lost to theft or violence. Without their unseen watch, Nabal's wealth could have been picked apart in a single night. This was no formal contract written in ink, but an unspoken agreement understood in that culture. In exchange for their vigilant protection, David's men could expect hospitality at the time of shearing a meal, provisions, perhaps wine to strengthen weary bodies. And so, when David sent 10 of his men to Nabal, the tone was one of honor and respect, not entitlement. They brought a blessing before they brought their request: peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. 1 Samuel 25-6. David was not asking for silver or gold, only food and drink to sustain those who had risked their lives for another man's fortune. But Nabal, true to his name and nature, answered with scorn. He curled his lip and spat the words, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" 1 Samuel 25-10. These were not merely dismissive words, they were dangerous ones. David's victories over Israel's enemies had already spread throughout the land. Songs had been sung of him in the streets. To claim ignorance of David was to pretend blindness in the full light of day. Then, as if insult alone was not enough, Nabal struck deeper, accusing David of being nothing more than a runaway servant, a fugitive unworthy of respect. In that single moment, he not only denied David the honor due to him, but publicly reduced him to a common criminal. It was a calculated humiliation. And when a man like David, a seasoned warrior, the anointed future king of Israel, is shamed in such a way, the wound rarely remains unanswered. When David's men returned with Nabal's words still ringing in their ears, the thin thread of David's patience finally snapped. This was more than an insult. In the honor-bound culture of ancient Israel, it was a direct provocation, a public dismissal that struck at the very core of a man's dignity. David was no stranger to offense. He had endured Saul's jealousy, survived the treachery of false friends, and stood unflinching before giants. But this This was a deliberate shaming, thrown in his face by a man who had benefited from his protection and then mocked him for it. The insult burned like fire. In a heartbeat, David's mind shifted from peace to war. His voice was sharp, decisive, leaving no room for hesitation. Every man strap on his sword, 1 Samuel 25-13. The command rippled through the camp like a war drum. 400 men tightened their belts, the sound of steel ringing in the air. This was not a mission to intimidate or negotiate. David's intention was absolute. Not a single male in Nabal's household would see the next dawn. The path from insult to massacre had been set in motion with alarming speed, and all of it, every step toward the bloodshed, traced back to one man's reckless tongue. Yet here lies the detail that slips past many readers. Nabal had no idea. His careless words had lit a fuse, and instead of seeking water to quench it, he had gone back to his feast. The wine flowed freely. The laughter in his hall rose like the roar of the sea, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat. He sat in self-indulgence, oblivious to the judgment racing toward him through the darkening hills. Beyond those hills, the danger was very real. David and his men moved like a gathering storm, swift, silent, and armed for justice. Every step brought them closer to Nabal's gates, closer to a reckoning that would not be softened by negotiation. The question was no longer whether the blow would fall, but whether anything could possibly stop it before the first sword was drawn. Amid the tightening grip of danger, when the sound of approaching steel was still faint but inevitable, a single servant saw with chilling clarity what was about to happen. This was not mere tension. This was the kind of moment when one reckless decision could drown an entire household in ruin. And this servant knew his master too well. Nabal was far too stubborn, far too wrapped in his own arrogance to hear a word of warning. There was only one person under that roof who might be able to change the outcome: Abigail. He ran to her without hesitation, breathless with urgency, and spilled out the truth. David and his warriors were on their way, armed, furious, determined to leave no male alive in Nabal's household. It was a message heavy enough to crush the air from a person's lungs. Abigail felt that weight press against her chest as the servant's words sank in. There would be no time to gather the elders, no time to persuade her husband, who was likely already deep in wine and blind to the threat. Every moment spent in hesitation was a step closer to destruction. The image was clear in her mind. By morning, the house and lands would be nothing more than smoldering ruins. The ground stained red, the sounds of the feast replaced by the silence of death. There was no room for despair. Action had to come swiftly, decisively, and without error, drawing upon the discipline of a woman who had long kept a vast estate running smoothly despite the chaos around her. Abigail began issuing orders with precision. Servants moved quickly under her command: 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already slaughtered and dressed, roasted grain, clusters of raisins, cakes of figs, each item chosen not only for abundance but for its ability to signal goodwill. Loaded onto donkeys, it was more than a gesture. It was a carefully assembled peace offering, the kind that could speak where words might fail. Then came the most daring choice of all. She did not tell Nabal. In an age when a woman was expected to remain silent, to seek her husband's approval before acting, Abigail stepped beyond convention. This was not rebellion for its own sake. It was wisdom in motion, the courage to do what the moment demanded. She understood something her husband never could. David was no ordinary outlaw. He was the anointed of the Lord, chosen for the throne by God's own hand. To defy him was to stand against a destiny written in heaven itself. And so, with the night ahead and danger closing in, Abigail rode out toward the man whose sword could end her household and whose favor could save it. Abigail saw with perfect clarity what Nabal, in his stubborn blindness, could never grasp. David was not merely a warrior wandering the hills. He was the man anointed by God for the throne, and his wrath was not something that could be brushed aside. The time for hesitation had passed. The cool night air pressed against her skin as she urged her donkey forward, her heart steady but her mind calculating every possible outcome. The road ahead curved down toward the valley, and there, in the wavering light of torches, she saw them 400 warriors, their armor glinting like the edge of a storm, their steps purposeful, their faces carved with the resolve of vengeance. At their head rode David, eyes fixed forward, yav set, his entire bearing that of a man ready to execute swift and final justice. The sight was enough to chill even the bravest heart. But Abigail did not slow. Every second mattered. As the distance between them narrowed, she did something no noblewoman of her standing would dare. Without waiting for formality or permission, she dismounted from her donkey, her garments brushing the dust of the road, and she fell prostrate before David. This was no graceful courtly bow. It was the desperate lowering of herself in a moment when lives hung in the balance. Dust clung to her clothing, but her voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "My lord, let the blame be on me alone," and flaked. The words struck the air with the weight of the unexpected. David, his sword still in hand, faltered for the first time that night. This was not the posture of an enemy, nor the arrogance of one trying to bargain. It was humility wrapped in courage, a plea that reached beyond the ears to touch the conscience. Abigail seized that moment. She spoke truth without embellishment, acknowledging the reckless folly of her husband without excusing it. "Please do not let my lord pay attention to this wicked man, Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him." 1 Samuel 25-25. But Abigail's wisdom did not stop at defending her household. She lifted her words to something far greater, David's destiny. With a voice firm and prophetic, she declared, "The Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live." 1 Samuel 25-28. These were not empty flatteries. They were a reminder of the man David truly was chosen. Righteous, a servant of the Most High. She was, in that moment, pulling him back from the brink, calling him to remember the anointing oil that once dripped down his head. The songs sung of his victories, the God who had already written his story. And then, with the precision of someone who understood the long weight of memory, she warned him, "When the Lord has fulfilled for my lord every good thing he promised, you will not have on your conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed." 1 Samuel 25-30-31. It was a plea wrapped in foresight, a vision of the day David would look back on this night, grateful that he had not let vengeance stain his hands. In that moment, Abigail was doing far more than protecting her home. She was interceding for David's own soul, shielding him from a choice that could tarnish the throne before he ever sat on it. And as the torchlight flickered against the edges of their faces, the question began to shift. Was this night about saving Nabal's household? Or had God sent Abigail to save David from himself? The future king stood motionless. The tension in the air, which only moments ago felt sharp enough to cut, began to shift. His breathing slowed, the storm in his eyes easing as her words took root. The iron grip on his sword softened until his hand hung loosely at his side. What had seemed impossible moments earlier had just unfolded before the eyes of 400 armed men. Abigail had not only halted his advance, she had pierced through the armor of his anger and touched the heart beneath. David, the warrior who had faced down lions, giants, and armies, now stood humbled before the wisdom of one unarmed woman. His voice, when it came, was not the roar of a commander, but the steady confession of a man aware of divine intervention. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. 1 Samuel 25-32. It was an acknowledgement that this meeting was no accident, that the God who had anointed him for the throne had also appointed this moment to keep his hands clean from needless blood. In a single bold act, Abigail had accomplished 3 things few in history could claim. She had turned away wrath, burning hot enough to consume. She had preserved the lives of every innocent in her household. And she had set the future king of Israel back on the path of his divine calling. The men behind David, swords ready only moments earlier, now stood in the glow of an unexpected peace, witnesses to the power of wisdom over force. But Abigail's task was not yet finished. The most dangerous part of her mission still lay ahead, the return. Behind her waited Nabal, unaware of how close death had come to his gates, oblivious to the judgment that had been marching toward him until God himself intervened through her courage. What would happen when she told him the truth? Would he rage? Would he dismiss it as nothing? Or would the weight of her words strike him in a way nothing else ever had? Abigail rode back toward her home under the pale light of dawn, the hooves of her donkey striking the earth in a steady rhythm. The events of the night clung to her mind, the confrontation she had prevented, the lives she had saved. In the future king, she had reminded of his divine purpose. Yet one matter still loomed ahead like an unspoken shadow: Nabal. She had spared him from David's sword, but she could not shield him from the truth of what he had done or from the consequences it might bring. As she crossed the threshold of the estate, the sharp scent of wine and roasted meat filled the air. Laughter rang out from the great hall, loud, careless, the kind that blinds men to the edge of the cliff beneath their feet. There he was, Nabal, seated at the head of a lavish table, feasting as though he himself were a king. Servants darted about with platters and pitchers, the floor sticky with spilled drink, the air thick with indulgence. He had no idea that the night had almost ended with his blood staining the ground outside his own gates. Abigail remained silent. To speak to him now, drowned in wine and arrogance, would be as fruitless as sowing seed into stone. She had learned long ago that timing could determine the weight of a truth, and tonight was not the time. So she waited. When morning came and the sunlight crept over the hills, Nabal stirred from his drunken stupor. The noise of the feast had died away. The air in the hall was heavy with the remnants of excess. His mind was clearer, but the outcome of his actions had already been set in motion. Abigail approached him with calm resolve. She told him everything: how David, with 400 armed men, had been moments away from wiping out every male in the household, how she had gathered bread, wine, meat, and fruit into a peace offering, how she had ridden through the night to stand in the path of a warrior's wrath, and how David had spared them not because of Nabal, but in spite of him. because of her intervention. As her words struck him, something inside Nabal shattered. The Bible records it with chilling precision. His heart failed him, and he became like a stone. 1 Samuel 25-37. In that moment, the blood seemed to drain from his face until it was as pale as death itself. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out, not even a gasp. His eyes widened and fixed on nothing, glassy and unblinking. His hands, once quick to grasp wine and wealth, now hung lifeless at his sides, every muscle locked, his body rigid as though the earth itself had claimed him. Some say it was a stroke, others that terror clamped down on his chest until the life could no longer flow through his veins. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Nabal became a living corpse, trapped in his own flesh, breathing shallow, unable to move, unable to speak. For 10 long days he lingered in this prison of bone and skin, neither fully alive nor fully dead, as if suspended in the cold shadow of judgment. And then the sentence was carried out, without a sword lifted against him, without a hand laid upon him. The Lord himself struck Nabal down. The man who had feasted like a king was silenced in an instant, and all his wealth, pride, and stubborn defiance crumbled into the dust with him. His arrogance had nearly destroyed his household, his wealth, his power, his stubborn pride. None of it could save him from the justice of God. But while judgment had fallen upon Nabal with the weight of divine justice, a very different decree was about to be spoken over Abigail, one not of wrath, but of favor. When the news of Nabal's death reached David's camp, the future king's response was not the gloating satisfaction of a man avenged, but the solemn gratitude of one who recognized the hand of God. Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. 1 Samuel 25-39. David understood what few warriors in his position would, that vengeance belonged to God alone. He had stayed his hand, and because of it, his conscience was clear. Justice had been executed without his sword drawing blood. The same God who had shielded him from Saul's spear had now shielded him from the stain of needless killing. But then, in a turn few could have anticipated, David sent messengers to Abigail, not merely to convey gratitude for her courage, but to deliver an entirely different message: come and be my wife. It was not just a proposal of marriage, but an invitation into a new chapter of life, one that would lift her from the shadow of a fool's household into the light of a king's future reign. For Abigail, the contrast could not have been greater. Not long ago, she had ridden out into the night under the weight of desperation, facing 400 armed men in a gamble to save lives. Now she would ride again, but this time with the winds of joy at her back. There was no fear in her steps, no uncertainty in her voice. She accepted without hesitation. Surrounded by her attendants, she left behind the walls that had once confined her to sorrow, carrying with her the wisdom that had saved her household and shaped her destiny. The woman who had once stood between death and her people was now stepping into the life of a queen in waiting. Her wisdom had not only preserved lives, it had rewritten the path of her future, from the wife of a fool to the bride of the anointed. Abigail's story became a living testimony that courage, guided by discernment, can turn the tide of history, and that favor, when sent from God, will find you even after the longest night. Abigail's journey had turned with the force of a divine tide. Once bound to a man whose name itself meant fool, whose arrogance nearly destroyed them all, she now stood beside the anointed future king of Israel. Yet her story did not close with a royal proposal or a wedding feast. Her legacy was not simply the tale of a woman rescued from a bad marriage. It was the story of a life repositioned by God's hand for a purpose that would echo far beyond her own years. When she left Nabal's estate, she did not merely step away from a home filled with wealth and possessions. She walked away from a life spent in constant uncertainty, a life where her days were defined by managing the reckless decisions of a man who could not see past his own pride. She exchanged the corridors of a fool's household for the uncertain roads of a divine mission. What lay ahead was not comfort, but calling. She now moved within a plan unfolding before her very eyes, one written long before she was born. But life as the wife of David was nothing like the life of a queen in waiting. David was a man forever in motion, pursued by King Saul's relentless hatred, moving from stronghold to wilderness, leading a band of warriors whose loyalty was tested by hunger, exhaustion, and battle after battle. To be joined to him was to share his exile, in his hardships and his dangers. Abigail did not enter a palace draped in luxury. She stepped into a life where the night sky was often her ceiling and the sound of marching feet her morning bell. Yet in all of it, she never murmured complaint, never pushed back against the road she had chosen. Her resolve was as steady as the faith that had guided her to stand before David on that fateful night. She knew the weight of his calling, the oil of anointing that had once run down his head. Where Nabal had scoffed at David's destiny, Abigail embraced it as her own. There was, however, another reality to face. David's household was not hers alone to command. During this time, David was also married to Ahinoam of Jezreel. The scriptures offer little detail about Ahinoam's influence or presence, while Abigail's wisdom and discernment stand clearly in the biblical record. Some scholars suggest that among David's wives, Abigail may have been the one he trusted most, not merely because she was striking in beauty, but because her intelligence could match his strategy. Her calm could steady his storms, and her unwavering faith could anchor him to God's plan, even when the pressures of kingship loomed like mountains. Yet even within the shelter of David's household, Abigail's life was not free from the reach of suffering. Danger seemed to follow David and all who were bound to him, for his path was a path of constant conflict. While David and his men were away on another campaign, the unthinkable happened. The Amalekites, ruthless raiders who preyed upon the unprotected, swept down on their camp at Ziklag. With no warriors left to defend it, they burned the settlement to the ground, reducing homes and supplies to smoldering ash. Then, in a cruel twist, they seized every woman and child, driving them away like spoils of war. Among the captives was Abigail. For a brief, harrowing moment, it seemed as if her story, the story of a woman who had defied convention, turned away bloodshed, and walked into the favor of God, would end in devastation and exile. She was no longer the rescuer, she was the one in need of rescue. Yet this was not a moment for despair. Far away, when news reached David, he did not sit idly in grief. He sought the counsel of the Lord, and the answer came clear: pursue. With divine direction burning in his spirit, David led his men in relentless pursuit of the Amalekites. The march was grueling, but the fire of determination drove them forward. When they finally caught up with the raiders, the battle was fierce, the clash of steel and cries of war echoing across the wilderness. And then, by the hand of God, the victory was theirs. Every captive was freed. Nothing was lost. Abigail, who had once ridden into the night to stand between David and a massacre, now found herself brought back into safety by the very man she had once saved. It was more than a reversal of roles, it was a seal on their bond, a testament to the way God had intertwined their destinies. In her darkest moment, deliverance had come, and it had come through the hands of the man she had believed in from the very beginning. As the years passed, and the crown of Israel finally rested on David's head, the memory of Abigail remained woven into the tapestry of his story. Though the pages of Scripture grow quiet regarding her later years, the weight of her influence could not be erased. She had done far more than prevent a single act of bloodshed. She had demonstrated that wisdom, when joined with courage, could redirect the very flow of history. In the heat of an impending massacre, she had stepped forward with nothing but her voice, her discernment, and her faith, and in doing so, she had preserved not only lives, but the integrity of the man who would become king. Abigail's courage had proven something timeless. A single act, rooted in obedience to God, can alter destiny. Her story might be overshadowed in popular memory by the towering figures who surround David's life: the giant Goliath felled in the valley, the tragic King Saul, the loyal Jonathan, the infamous Bathsheba. Yet, when the scrolls of God's purposes are unrolled, her name stands with theirs in significance. She did not win her place through the swing of a sword or the command of an army, but through the quiet strength of a woman who understood both the moment and the God who ruled over it. She was more than a wise counselor. She was a woman of decisive action, unshakable faith, and a spiritual clarity that pierced through chaos. Abigail knew how to hear the whisper of God's will and move without delay, even when it meant defying the customs of her day, even when it meant standing in the path of armed men with nothing to shield her but truth. To this very day, her name endures as a living symbol of wisdom, humility, and courage. Her life stands as a challenge to each of us. Will we have the courage to step out in faith when the moment calls? Will we trust the plan of the Lord, even when the road ahead is hidden in shadows and uncertainty? Will we choose the path of wisdom when fear whispers for us to turn back? These questions are not for history alone, they are for us, here and now. For the God who guided Abigail's steps is the same God who orders ours. The choice that stood before her still stands before us: to act in faith or to remain still, to trust in His timing or cling to our own understanding. Abigail chose faith. She chose trust. She chose wisdom over fear. And because she did, her name is forever written in the pages of Scripture as the woman who, in a single night of courage, changed everything. Abigail's story may have unfolded thousands of years ago, but its echoes reach straight into our world today. In an age where pride is often louder than humility and impulse overshadows discernment, her life is a living reminder that wisdom is still the greatest defense and courage and the surest path forward. She stepped into a moment where hesitation could have meant death, and instead of shrinking back, she moved with faith, clarity, and purpose. To me, what's most powerful is that she didn't just save her household, she shaped the destiny of a king. She reminded David and all of us that God's plan is bigger than our tempers, our fears, and even our circumstances. One act of faith can change the trajectory of a life, sometimes even the course of history. And here's where it speaks to us now. There will be moments when you and I are standing in the Abigail moment, a crossroad where action is costly, but silence is fatal. In those moments, will we choose wisdom over reaction? Will we trust God's timing over our own impatience? Will we risk stepping into the unknown if it means walking in His will? I believe that if Abigail could do it in the face of armed warriors, we can do it in our boardrooms, our families, our friendships, and our communities. If this story stirred something in you, let's keep it alive. Like this video so others can discover it. Share it with someone who needs courage today. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next story of faith and boldness. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what Abigail moment you faced in your own life. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for walking this journey with me, whether you've supported through super thanks or simply by your time and attention. It matters more than you know. May you walk in wisdom, stand in courage, and trust the God who still writes stories like Abigail's in our time.